She stood in front of that dusty counter with 7 cents clutched in her fist, 1 penny short of bread, and the whole town watching to see if pride or hunger would win. What happened next would change everything. I'm Clara Whitmore, and this is the story of how a single act of mercy in a dying frontier town became the foundation of an empire. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The bell above the door of Hutchins' General Store coughed out a thin, rusty jangle when Clara pushed inside. She kept her chin level, even though her stomach had been gnawing at itself since yesterday afternoon. The floorboards creaked under her worn boots, and every head in the place swiveled toward her like she'd walked in trailing smoke. Blackstone Ridge wasn't a town that forgot faces, especially not hers. Clara moved toward the counter where old Hutchins stood wiping his hands on a rag that had probably been white once. His expression didn't change when he saw her, but his eyes flicked down to her empty hands and back up again. She could feel the weight of every stare boring into her shoulders. The banker's wife pretending to examine a bolt of calico, the Garrett boys leaning against the pickle barrel, that sanctimonious schoolteacher Miss Pruitt clutching her shopping basket like Clara might steal it. "Ma'am?" Hutchins nodded, his voice flat as the desert outside. "Good morning." Clara's voice came out steady. She'd practiced that. "I need a loaf of bread, please." Hutchins reached behind him without a word and set a dense brown loaf on the counter between them. It wasn't fresh. Nothing in Blackstone Ridge was fresh anymore, but the yeasty smell made Clara's throat tighten. 8 cents. She opened her hand and counted out the coins one by one onto the scarred wood. 3 pennies, 2 more, another. One last penny rolled from her palm and clinked against the others. 7 cents. The silence in the store pressed down like a physical thing. Clara stared at the coins, then at the bread, then at Hutchins. Her mind raced through her options and came up empty every single time. She had nothing left to sell. She'd already pawned her mother's wedding ring last month to pay the rent on the boarding house room she couldn't afford to keep much longer. Her sewing needles were her livelihood, and the few dresses she owned were already mended past respectability. "I'm one short," she said quietly. Hutchins nodded. He didn't move to take the bread back, but he didn't push it toward her either. The man wasn't cruel, just beaten down by the same hard times that had strangled this town since the silver mines collapsed. He had his own ledgers to balance, his own family to feed. Behind her, someone snickered. Clara didn't turn around. She knew that sound. It was the particular cruelty of people who'd only recently climbed out of their own holes and couldn't wait to look down at someone still digging. "I'll come back tomorrow," Clara said, though she had no idea where another penny would come from. She started to pull her hand back. "Wait." The voice came from near the door. Clara turned and saw him for the first time. A tall man in a dusty coat, hat pulled low, weathered face that looked like it had been carved by wind and hard decisions. He had a coil of rope over one shoulder and the kind of stillness that came from men who spent more time with animals than people. Elias Boone. She knew the name even if she'd never spoken to him. Everyone in Blackstone Ridge knew about the Boone Ranch up in the hills, how Elias's father had built it from nothing, and how Elias had nearly lost it all after the old man died. How he'd clawed his way back through blizzards and droughts and a cattle market that tried to bury him. How he kept to himself and spoke only when words were absolutely necessary. He walked to the counter, his boots deliberate and heavy. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she waited for whatever was about to happen. Charity, probably. Pity wrapped up in good intentions that would carve out another piece of her dignity. But Elias didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Hutchins. "I'll take that rope, and I need a bag of cornmeal, 20 pounds. He paused, then gestured vaguely toward the shelf behind the counter. "And that bread there. My usual order." Hutchins blinked. "You don't usually take bread." "Well, I am today." Elias's tone didn't invite discussion. He pulled coins from his pocket and counted them out with blunt, scarred fingers. "That cover it?" Hutchins glanced at Clara, then at Elias, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that'll do." Elias gathered his supplies, tucked the bread under his arm with the same casual indifference he'd shown the rope and cornmeal, and headed for the door. He paused when he reached Clara, finally meeting her eyes for just a second. "Ma'am," he said, and tipped his hat. Then he was gone, the bell jangling behind him. Clara stood frozen, her 7 cents still scattered on the counter. Around her, the store had gone absolutely silent. Even Miss Pruitt had stopped pretending to shop. Hutchins cleared his throat and swept Clara's coins toward himself with one weathered hand. "Reckon you'll want to collect your bread before it gets any colder," he said. She looked at him, confused. "Boone paid for it," Hutchins explained, his voice carefully neutral. "Said it was his usual order, but we both know he's never taken bread from me before. He's letting you keep your pride, girl. I'd suggest you take it." Clara's throat closed up entirely. She managed a nod, collected the loaf with shaking hands, and walked out of that store with her spine straight and her eyes burning. She didn't cry. She refused to cry in front of these people who'd watched her fall and done nothing to break it. But outside, in the harsh morning light, she stood on the board sidewalk and pressed the bread against her chest and let herself feel the weight of what had just happened. Not charity, not pity. Something else entirely. Something that had allowed her to leave that store without losing the last shred of dignity she had left. She didn't know Elias Boone. She didn't know why he'd done it. But as she walked back toward her tiny boarding house room, Clara understood that she'd just witnessed something rare in Blackstone Ridge. Kindness that didn't demand gratitude or extract humiliation as payment. She would not forget that. The bread lasted 3 days. Clara rationed it carefully, eating just enough to quiet her stomach so she could focus on her sewing. She'd taken in mending work from the few families in town who could still afford to pay, and though the wages were barely enough to survive on, it was honest work and she was grateful for it. But gratitude didn't pay rent. On the 4th day after the incident at Hutchins' store, Mrs. Calloway knocked on Clara's door with the expression of a woman about to perform an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Miss Whitmore," she began, her voice tight, "I'm afraid I'll need this month's rent by Friday, or I'll have to let the room to someone else. I've got a family coming in from Silver Creek, and they're willing to pay in advance." Clara nodded. "I understand. I'll have it by Friday." It was Tuesday. She had 2 days and exactly 12 cents to her name. After Mrs. Calloway left, Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked around the cramped room that had been her home for 8 months. It wasn't much. A bed, a washstand, a single chair, a trunk containing everything she owned, but it was hers. Or it had been. She thought about her options. There weren't many. She could try to take in more mending, but there was only so much sewing she could do in 2 days, and most of the town was barely scraping by themselves. She could ask for an extension, but Mrs. Calloway had been more than patient already. She could leave Blackstone Ridge entirely and try her luck somewhere else, but that required money for a stage ticket and enough left over to survive until she found work. Or she could swallow what remained of her pride and ask for help. Clara's hands curled into fists in her lap. She'd spent the last year and a half fighting to stay independent after her father died and left her with nothing but debts and a reputation for being difficult. She'd lost their house, sold everything of value, and worked herself to exhaustion trying to prove she could survive on her own terms. The thought of giving up now, of becoming someone's charity case or worse, someone's obligation, made her feel physically ill. But she was out of options. That evening, as the sun bled red across the desert hills, Clara walked to the edge of town where the road split toward the ranches in the high country. She didn't have a horse. She didn't even have decent walking shoes. But she knew where the Boone Ranch was. Everyone did. And she knew that Elias Boone had given her a gift she couldn't repay. Maybe he'd let her earn it instead. The walk took 3 hours. By the time Clara saw the ranch building silhouetted against the darkening sky, her feet were screaming and her dress was coated in dust. The Boone Ranch wasn't grand. Nothing in this part of the territory was grand, but it was solid. A 2-story house that looked like it had weathered 1,000 storms. A large barn, corrals, and outbuildings spread across a valley that probably flooded in spring and baked to stone in summer. Smoke rose from the chimney. Somewhere, cattle lowed in the gathering dusk. Clara stopped at the edge of the property, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing? She didn't know this man. She had no claim on his generosity. For all she knew, he'd bought that bread on impulse and forgotten about it 5 minutes later. Coming here, showing up uninvited to ask for work, it felt desperate because it was desperate. But desperation was just another word for having nothing left to lose. She walked up to the house and knocked. The door opened after a moment, and Elias Boone stood there in his shirt sleeves, suspenders hanging loose, a cup of coffee in one hand. His expression shifted from surprise to something she couldn't quite read when he recognized her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Boone." Clara fought to keep her voice steady. "I apologize for coming unannounced. I need to speak with you, if you have a moment." He studied her for a few seconds, took in her dusty dress, her exhausted face, the determined set of her shoulders, and then stepped back. "Come in." The inside of the house was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture looked handmade and built to last. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something cooking on the stove. Clara realized with a sharp pang that she hadn't eaten since morning. Elias gestured to a chair near the fireplace. "Sit down before you fall down. You walked all the way from town?" "Yes." "That's a damn fool thing to do after dark." He didn't sound angry, just matter of fact. He poured a second cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and set it in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "When's the last time you ate?" "This morning." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. "Mr. Boone, I came here to ask if you have any work I could do. I'm a seamstress by trade, but I can cook and clean and mend and do whatever else you might need. I don't expect charity. I want to earn wages, fair wages." Elias leaned against the edge of the table, his arms crossed. "What happened?" "I'm being evicted. I owe rent I can't pay, and I'm out of options." Clara met his eyes directly. "You helped me once without asking for anything in return. I'm not here to beg for more help. I'm here to offer my labor in exchange for payment. If you don't need anyone, I'll leave and try somewhere else." "Where else?" "I don't know yet." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady and uncomfortably perceptive. Clara got the sense that Elias Boone didn't miss much, and what he saw now was a woman balancing on the edge of collapse who was too stubborn to admit it. Finally, he spoke. "I've got a housekeeper who comes twice a week, but she's got her own family and can't do more than that. The place needs proper care, cooking, cleaning, mending, all the things I don't have time for because I'm running cattle and trying to keep this operation from going under. I can pay $20 a month plus room and board." Clara's breath caught. $20 was more than she'd made in 3 months of mending. "That's very generous." "It's fair," Elias corrected. "You'll earn it. Ranch work doesn't stop, and neither will you if you take this job. But you'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly, and I won't ask questions about your past or make assumptions about your future. You do the work, I pay the wages." That's the arrangement. It was everything she'd hoped for, and nothing she'd expected. Clara searched his face for the catch, the hidden condition, the inevitable demand that would turn this into something she couldn't accept. But all she saw was a tired man offering a straightforward deal. "When can I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you're ready. Tonight, if you want a bed that isn't in a boarding house about to throw you out." "Tonight, then." Elias nodded and straightened up. "I'll show you the room. It's small, but it's private and the roof doesn't leak. We'll settle the details in the morning." He led her upstairs to a narrow room with a single window overlooking the valley. The bed was made, the floor was swept, and there was even a small dresser and a wash basin. It was more than Clara had dared hope for. "Thank you," she said quietly. Elias paused in the doorway. "Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen how much work there is." But his voice was gentler than his words, and when he looked at her, Clara saw something unexpected in his expression. Recognition. Like he knew exactly what it felt like to be 1 penny short of survival. "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said. "Good. Neither am I." He tipped his head toward her. "Get some rest, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow starts early on a ranch." After he left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and let herself breathe. For the first time in months, she wasn't counting pennies or calculating how many more days she could stretch her last resources. She had work. She had shelter. She had a chance to rebuild the life that had collapsed around her, and she had no intention of wasting it. Boom. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of roosters and the low murmur of cattle in the distance. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory flooded back and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. The Boone Ranch, her new job, the beginning of whatever came next. She dressed in the same dusty dress from yesterday, made the bed with military precision, and went downstairs. The house was silent, but through the kitchen window she could see a light burning in the barn. Elias was already working. Clara surveyed the kitchen with a critical eye. It was functional but neglected, dishes stacked in the basin, A coffee pot that looked like it had never been properly cleaned, dust settling on every surface, and a pantry that was surprisingly well stocked but utterly disorganized. She rolled up her sleeves. By the time Elias came in from the barn an hour later, Clara had scrubbed the dishes, swept the floor, reorganized the pantry, and had breakfast cooking on the stove. She'd found eggs, bacon, and the ingredients for biscuits, and the whole kitchen smelled like a home instead of a place where a man just survived. Elias stopped in the doorway and stared. "Morning," Clara said, not looking up from the pan. "Coffee's fresh, breakfast will be ready in 5 minutes." He moved to the table slowly like he was walking through someone else's house. "You didn't have to do all this on your first morning." "Yes, I did." Clara plated the food and set it in front of him. "You're paying me to work, so I'm going to work." Elias picked up his fork, took a bite of the biscuit, and went very still. "When's the last time someone cooked breakfast in this house?" "I have no idea." "When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" "Can't remember." "That's what I thought." Clara sat down across from him with her own plate. "I'll need to know your schedule so I can plan meals around your work. And I saw the mending pile in the front room. I'll get to that this afternoon after I finish cleaning upstairs." "You don't have to do everything in one day." "I'm not trying to do everything in one day. I'm trying to do my job." Clara met his eyes steadily. "I meant what I said, Mr. Boone. I'm not here for charity. I'm here to earn my wages." Something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe, or understanding. "All right, but you call me Elias. Mr. Boone was my father, and he's 6 years dead. Only if you call me Clara. Deal." They ate in companionable silence. Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd had enough food to feel genuinely full, and she had to force herself to eat slowly instead of wolfing it down like a starving animal. Across from her, Elias ate with the methodical efficiency of a man who viewed meals as fuel rather than pleasure, but she noticed he took a second biscuit. After breakfast, Elias pushed his chair back. "I've got to check the fence line in the north pasture. I'll be gone most of the day. If you need anything, the ranch hand, Tom, should be around somewhere. He's about 100 years old and deaf in one ear, but he knows this place better than I do." "I'll be fine." Elias nodded, then hesitated. "Clara, if this doesn't work out, if it's too much or not what you expected, you tell me. I don't want you staying out of obligation." "The same goes for you," Clara replied. "If my work isn't satisfactory, you tell me." "I will." But as the days turned into weeks, there was nothing unsatisfactory about Clara's work. She transformed the Boone Ranch from a place where a man merely survived into something that felt like an actual home. She cooked meals that made Elias stop and savor his food instead of shoveling it down. She mended every torn shirt and worn pair of trousers in the house. She cleaned corners that probably hadn't been touched since Elias's mother died. She organized the chaos of paperwork and receipts that had been breeding in the study like tumbleweeds. And she asked questions. "Why are you selling cattle to Morrison instead of taking them to the auction in Silver Creek?" she asked one evening while they were going over the ranch accounts. Elias looked up, surprised. "Morrison pays on time and doesn't short the weight. He also pays 20% below market rate. If you can get the cattle to Silver Creek, you'd more than cover the cost of transport." "I'd have to hire drovers." "That's expensive." "Less expensive than losing 20% on every sale." Clara tapped the ledger with her pencil. "You're choosing security over profit, but you're stable enough now that you can afford to take the risk. One good auction would give you the capital to make real improvements, new breeding stock, better equipment, maybe even expand the herd." Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her. "How do you know about cattle markets?" "I don't. I know about margins and risk assessment. My father ran a feed store before he died. I kept his books for years." Claire's expression was carefully neutral. "He made the same mistake you're making, chose the safe option every time until the safe option stopped being safe." "And then what happened?" "He went bankrupt and drank himself to death. I'm trying to keep you from doing the same, minus the drinking part." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, rusty sound like he was out of practice. "All right, I'll take the herd to Silver Creek next month. But if this goes badly, I'm blaming you." "If it goes badly, I'll blame myself." Clara smiled slightly. "But it won't." She was right. The Silver Creek auction brought in nearly double what Morrison would have paid, and Elias came back with enough profit to buy 3 new breeding bulls and finally fix the irrigation system that had been limping along for years. More than that, he came back looking at Clara differently, not as hired help, but as a partner who understood the business as well as he did. That shift changed things between them in ways neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Clara had been at the ranch for 2 months when the first storm hit. She woke in the middle of the night to thunder that sounded like the sky was tearing itself apart and rain hammering against the roof with violent intensity. She sat up in bed, heart racing, and heard boots pounding down the hallway. Elias's voice carried through the door. "Clara, get dressed and come downstairs. We've got a problem." She dressed in 30 seconds and ran down to find Elias pulling on his coat, his face grim in the lamplight. "The cattle are spooked," he said quickly. "If they stampede in this weather, they'll tear through the fences and scatter to hell and back. I need to get out there and keep them calm, but I need someone at the house watching for flooding. The creek runs right past the south pasture, and if it overflows, it'll take out the barn foundation." "What do I do if it floods?" Clara asked, already moving toward the hooks where the rain slickers hung. "Ring the bell by the barn. I'll hear it and come back. But don't go out there yourself. The water moves fast and it'll pull you under." "Understood." Elias looked at her, rain already dripping from his hat brim. "You sure you're all right with this?" "I'm sure. Go." He went, disappearing into the black curtain of rain. Clara grabbed a lantern and stationed herself on the back porch where she could see the creek. The water was already high, turning brown and ugly, creeping closer to the barn with every passing minute. She watched for 2 hours, her clothes soaked through despite the slicker, her hands aching from gripping the lantern. The creek swelled higher, lapping at the edges of the pasture, and Clara's heart climbed into her throat. If it breached now, they'd lose everything. Then, gradually, the rain began to ease. The thunder moved east. The creek stopped rising and held steady just inches below disaster. Clara stayed on the porch until dawn broke gray and exhausted over the hills. When Elias finally rode back, muddy and drenched and leading a string of equally miserable cattle, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in one night. He dismounted and walked straight to Clara. "You all right?" "I'm fine. The creek held." "Yeah, I saw." He studied her face in the growing light. "You didn't have to stay out here the whole time." "Yes, I did." Elias nodded slowly. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Neither of them moved. The moment stretched out, awkward and charged, until Tom appeared from the barn and hollered something about a broken fence rail, and the spell broke. Elias turned away to deal with the crisis, and Clara went inside to make coffee and pretend her hands weren't shaking. But something had shifted. They both felt it. Kate. Word got around Blackstone Ridge that Clara Whitmore was living at the Boone Ranch, and the gossip started exactly the way gossip always did in small frontier towns. Fast, vicious, and wrapped in a thin veneer of concern. Clara heard it secondhand from Tom, who'd gone into town for supplies and come back looking uncomfortable. "They're saying you're Elias's kept woman," he told her bluntly while she was hanging laundry in the yard. "Saying he took advantage of you when you were desperate, and you're too ashamed to leave." Clara's hand stilled on the clothesline. "And what do you think?" Tom snorted. "I think they're bored and mean, same as always, but I figured you should know what's being said." "I appreciate that." Clara pinned up another shirt with more force than necessary. "Let them talk. I'm not leaving." But the gossip stung more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't the accusation itself. Clara knew the truth of her situation and didn't particularly care what small-minded people thought. What hurt was the realization that no matter how hard she worked or how respectable she tried to be, there would always be people ready to see her as something shameful. Elias found out about the rumors 3 days later when he went to town for a cattle sale and overheard 2 ranchers laughing about how Boone finally got himself a woman, even if he had to pay for the privilege. He didn't come home until after dark, and when he did, Clara could see the anger radiating off him like heat. "I heard what they're saying," he said without preamble, standing in the kitchen doorway while Clara finished washing the dinner dishes. "I'm sure you did. It's a small town." "It's a town full of jackals." Elias's voice was tight. "I'll set them straight." "Don't." Clara turned to face him. "You go back there and defend my honor, and you'll just make it worse. They'll say you're protecting your investment or trying to cover up the truth. The only way to handle people like that is to ignore them and let your actions speak louder than their words. So we just let them talk. We let them talk and we keep doing what we're doing. Eventually they'll get bored and move on to the next scandal." Clara dried her hands on her apron. Unless you'd prefer I leave. If my presence here is damaging your reputation, the hell with my reputation, Elias interrupted. I don't give a damn what those people think of me. I'm worried about you. I can handle small-town gossip, Elias. I've handled worse. They stared at each other across the kitchen, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Elias exhaled and dragged a hand through his hair. I should have thought about how this would look. I should have considered that bringing you here would cause problems for you. You gave me a job when I had nothing, Clara said quietly. You treated me with respect and paid me fair wages and never once made me feel like I owed you anything beyond honest work. Whatever people are saying, that's on them, not on you. Elias's expression softened. You're not what I expected, Clara Whitmore. What did you expect? Someone who'd take the help and run. Someone who'd do the bare minimum and spend the rest of the time figuring out how to get more for less. He shook his head. Instead, I got someone who works harder than I do and has better business sense than half the ranchers in this territory. Clara felt heat rise in her face. I told you I wasn't afraid of hard work. You did. I just didn't believe anyone could mean it the way you do. Elias moved closer, his voice dropping. Whatever people in town are saying, ignore them. You belong here as much as I do, and anyone who says different can go to hell. The conviction in his words made Clara's throat tighten. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just stay. I'm not planning on going anywhere. The moment hung between them, fragile and weighted with things neither of them was ready to name. Then Elias stepped back, breaking the spell, and muttered something about checking on the horses before bed. Clara watched him go and pressed a hand to her chest where her heart was beating too fast. She'd come to this ranch looking for work and survival. She hadn't expected to find something that felt dangerously close to home. And she definitely hadn't expected Elias Boone, a man who'd bought her bread without humiliating her, who'd given her a job without demanding gratitude, who defended her reputation even when it cost him his own. Clara had spent the last year and a half building walls around herself to survive. But those walls were starting to crack, and the light getting in was both terrifying and irresistible. She didn't know what happened next, but for the first time since her father died and her world collapsed, Clara Whitmore allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face the future alone. The gossip didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. Clara went into town exactly once in the month after the rumors started, and she felt the weight of every stare like a physical blow. Women she'd mended dresses for crossed the street to avoid her. The banker's wife turned her back entirely. Even old Hutchins looked uncomfortable when she came into his store for thread, though he still took her money without comment. She walked out with her purchases and her head high, but the moment she was back on the ranch road, her hands started shaking. By the time she reached the house, she'd made a decision. She wouldn't go back to Blackstone Ridge unless absolutely necessary. She didn't need their approval or their business. She had work here, and that was enough. Elias noticed, of course. He didn't say anything directly, but the next time he went to town, he came back with enough supplies to last 2 months and a grim set to his jaw that told Clara he'd heard more ugly things he couldn't unhear. They didn't talk about it. They just kept working. October arrived with cold winds that stripped the cottonwoods bare and turned the grass brittle. Clara spent her mornings preserving what was left of the garden, her afternoons mending and organizing, and her evenings going over the ranch books with Elias. They'd fallen into a rhythm that felt natural despite its strangeness. Two people orbiting each other carefully, neither quite willing to acknowledge how much they'd come to depend on the other's presence. Then the drought hit. It started as a dry spell, which wasn't unusual for late fall. But when November came and went without rain, and December arrived with nothing but wind and dust, the reality set in. The creek that fed the ranch started shrinking. The water troughs needed filling twice as often. The cattle grew lean and restless, and the grass turned to powder under their hooves. Elias drove himself harder than Clara had ever seen. He was up before dawn and didn't come in until well after dark, his face gaunt with exhaustion and worry. She'd find him in the study late at night, staring at maps and weather records, trying to calculate how long they could hold out. "We need rain," he said one night, his voice flat. "Not in a month. Not in 3 weeks. Now." Clara set a cup of coffee in front of him. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I'm considering selling half the herd before they starve to death." Elias rubbed his eyes. "But if I sell now, the price will be bottom of the barrel because everyone else is doing the same thing. I'll lose money on cattle I spent years breeding, And if the drought breaks next month, I'll have sold for nothing. And if it doesn't break? Then I lose everything anyway, and I'll have waited too long to salvage anything. Clara pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. What does your gut tell you? Elias looked at her, surprised. My gut? You've been ranching your whole life. You know this land. You know the weather patterns. You know how cattle survive hard seasons. What does your instinct say? He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the edge of the desk. My gut says hold on. We're not in the worst of it yet, but we're not in the dying stretch either. If I can keep the herd alive through January, we might make it. Then that's what we do. We? Elias's mouth quirked slightly. This isn't your risk, Clara. You're paid wages, whether the ranch makes money or goes under. If the ranch goes under, I lose my job and my home. That makes it my risk too. Clara leaned forward. What do you need me to do? What she did over the next 6 weeks was everything. Clara took over every task that didn't require physical strength or specialized knowledge, freeing Elias and Tom to focus entirely on keeping the cattle alive. She cooked meals that stretched their dwindling supplies without sacrificing nutrition. She hauled water when the well started running low. She rode out to the pastures with extra feed when the grass gave out completely. She learned to doctor sick cattle under Tom's terse instruction, holding struggling calves while he forced medicine down their throats. And she kept the books, watching their savings drain away like water through a sieve, calculating and recalculating how many more weeks they could survive before the numbers stopped making sense. It was brutal work that left her exhausted and aching, but Clara discovered something unexpected. She was good at it. Not just competent, but genuinely skilled. She could anticipate problems before they became crises, streamline processes that had always been done a certain way simply because no one had thought to question them, and make decisions under pressure that turned out to be right more often than not. Elias noticed. He started asking her opinion on things that went beyond household management, which pasture to move the herd to, whether to buy feed or conserve cash, how to negotiate with suppliers who were jacking up prices because they knew everyone was desperate. You're better at this than I am, he said one evening after Clara had talked him out of a bad deal with a feed merchant. I'm not better, I just look at it differently. Clara closed the ledger. You see the ranch as something you have to protect. I see it as something we have to build. What's the difference? Protection is defensive. Building is offensive. She met his eyes. You're so afraid of losing what your father built that you're not letting yourself imagine what it could become. Elias was quiet for a long moment. My father spent 30 years building this place. I almost lost it all in 2. I don't have the luxury of imagination. You have the necessity of it, Clara said quietly, because if this drought doesn't break, protecting what you have won't be enough. You'll need to reinvent what survival looks like. He stared at her, something shifting in his expression. When did you get so damn smart? I've always been this smart. You just weren't paying attention. Elias laughed, a real laugh this time, not the rusty sound he'd made months ago. Fair enough? The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile. Then Tom's shout from outside shattered it, and they both jumped up and ran for the door. One of the cattle had broken through a weakened fence and gotten itself tangled in barbed wire. By the time they reached it, the animal was thrashing and bleeding, its panicked bellows echoing across the valley. Elias and Tom worked to cut it free while Clara held the lantern steady and murmured nonsense words meant to calm the terrified creature. It took 20 minutes to extract the steer and another hour to treat its wounds. By the time they finished, all 3 of them were covered in blood and exhausted. The steer limped away to rejoin the herd, and Elias stood in the middle of the pasture, shoulders slumped, looking like he'd just lost a fight. I can't keep doing this, he said quietly. Tom and Clara exchanged glances. Neither of them spoke. I'm one man trying to hold back a disaster with my bare hands, and it's not working. Elias's voice was rough. I'm going to lose this place. My father's legacy, everything he built, I'm going to lose it all because I'm not strong enough or smart enough or lucky enough to save it. Clara walked over to him and grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. Stop it. Stop what? Stop deciding you've failed before the fight is over. Her voice was fierce. You want to give up? Fine. Sell the herd tomorrow and walk away. But don't stand here and tell me you're not strong enough when I've watched you work yourself half to death for months trying to save this place. Don't tell me you're not smart enough when you've made decisions that kept us alive this long. And don't you dare tell me you're alone in this fight. Elias stared at her. Clara, I'm not just hired help anymore, Elias. I stopped being hired help the moment I started caring whether this ranch survived. So if you're going to quit, you quit. But I'm not quitting. I'm staying right here and fighting for this place until there's nothing left to fight for. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the distant sound of cattle. Tom cleared his throat and muttered something about checking the other fences, then disappeared into the darkness with the discretion of a man who knew when to make himself scarce. Elias took a step closer to Clara, his expression raw. Why? Why what? Why do you care so much about this place? You could leave tomorrow and find work somewhere else, somewhere easier, somewhere that isn't falling apart. His voice dropped. Why are you still here? Clara's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was the question she'd been avoiding for weeks, the truth she'd refused to examine too closely, because once she admitted it, there would be no taking it back. Because I'm not fighting for the ranch, she said finally. I'm fighting for you. The words hung in the cold air between them. Elias went very still, his eyes locked on hers, and Clara realized with a jolt of terror and exhilaration that she'd just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Clara, Elias said hoarsely, you don't mean that. Yes, I do. You can't. I'm a failing rancher with more debts than assets and a reputation that's dragging yours through the mud. I've got nothing to offer you except hard work and uncertainty. I don't remember asking you to offer me anything. Clara's voice shook slightly, but held steady. I'm telling you why I'm here. What you do with that information is your choice. Elias closed the distance between them in 2 strides and cupped her face in his rough, scarred hands. I'm going to kiss you, he said, his voice low and intent. And if that's not what you want, you need to tell me now. It's what I want, Clara whispered. He kissed her like a man who'd been holding back for months and had finally run out of restraint. It wasn't gentle or careful or anything like the romantic moments Clara had imagined as a girl. It was desperate and fierce and tasted like dust and exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. I'm in love with you, he said quietly. I have been since the day I saw you standing in that store, counting pennies and refusing to beg. I bought that bread because I couldn't stand watching you lose your dignity over something as stupid as 8 cents. And every day since then, I've watched you work harder than anyone I've ever known, and I've fallen deeper in love with you until it's the only thing I'm certain of in this whole mess. Clara's throat closed up entirely. Elias, I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you the truth because I'm tired of pretending I don't feel it. He pulled back slightly, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. But you should know that loving me right now is a bad bet. I might lose everything. We might end up with nothing. I've already had nothing, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. I know exactly what nothing looks like, and this isn't it. This, us here, fighting for something we built together, this is everything. Elias kissed her again, slower this time, and Clara let herself fall into it without fear. She'd spent so long protecting herself, building walls to keep the world from taking anything else from her. But Elias had never tried to take. He'd only ever given respect, trust, partnership, and now this fragile, precious thing that terrified her as much as it thrilled her. When they finally walked back to the house, hand in hand, Clara felt the weight of the decision settle over her like a cloak. She'd just tied her fate to Elias's, and if the ranch failed, they'd fail together. But she'd learned something crucial over the past months. Surviving alone was possible, but it wasn't living. Living required risk. It required letting someone else see your weakness and trusting them not to use it as a weapon. It required love. The next morning, Clara woke to find Elias already gone. She found a note on the kitchen table in his rough handwriting. Gone to check the north pasture, back by noon. There's something I need to show you. He came back just before midday, riding hard, his face flushed with something Clara couldn't quite read. She met him at the door, worry already tightening her chest. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Elias swung down from his horse, grinning like a madman. It's raining. Clara blinked. What? In the mountains. I could see the storm moving in from the north pasture. It's not here yet, but it's coming. He grabbed her by the waist and spun her around, laughing. It's coming, Clara. We're going to make it. The rain arrived that evening, cold and steady and absolutely beautiful. It fell for 3 days straight, soaking into the parched earth and filling the creek and turning the world green again. The cattle lifted their heads and drank deeply, and Tom declared it a miracle in his gruff, matter-of-fact way. Elias and Clara stood on the porch and watched the rain fall, their hands intertwined, neither of them speaking because there was nothing to say that the rain wasn't already saying for them. But the reprieve didn't last. The drought broke, but the damage was done. Half the ranchers in the territory had already sold their herds at a loss or walked away from their land entirely. The market was flooded with cheap cattle, and prices stayed depressed even after the grass came back. Elias had managed to keep his herd alive, but keeping them alive and making them profitable were two different things. "We need a new strategy," Clara said one night, the ledgers spread out between them. "We can't just wait for prices to recover. We need to find a different market." "What kind of market?" "Breeding stock." Clara tapped the page. "Your cattle survived one of the worst droughts in 20 years. That makes them valuable to ranchers who want herds that can withstand hard conditions. We market them as drought-resistant stock and sell them at premium prices to buyers who care more about survival traits than weight." Elias stared at the numbers, then at Clara. "That could work." "It will work, but we need to prove it first." Clara pulled out another sheet of paper covered in her neat handwriting. "I've been keeping detailed records of which cattle thrived during the drought and which ones barely made it. We breed selectively from the strong ones, and in 2 years we'll have a reputation as the place to buy if you want a herd that can survive anything. 2 years is a long time. Building something real always takes longer than you think it should." Clara met his eyes. "Are you willing to wait?" Elias reached across the table and took her hand. "With you? I'll wait as long as it takes." They spent the winter implementing Clara's plan, carefully selecting breeding pairs and documenting every decision. It was tedious, meticulous work that required more patience than profit, but Clara attacked it with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. And slowly, word started to spread. A rancher from Silver Creek came to look at Elias's cattle and left impressed. Another buyer from 2 territories over heard about the Boone Ranch's drought-resistant stock and made the trip to see for himself. By spring, Elias had sold 6 breeding bulls at prices that made the winter's depressed market feel like a distant memory. "You were right," he told Clara one evening, pulling her close on the porch, where they'd watched the rain fall months earlier. "About everything." "I'm not always right," Clara said, leaning into him. "I just think about things differently than you do." "Then I'm glad you're here to think differently." Elias kissed the top of her head. "What would I do without you?" "You'd survive. You always do." Clara tilted her face up to look at him. "But maybe you wouldn't be happy." "No," Elias agreed quietly. "I wouldn't be happy at all." Spring turned to summer, and the ranch thrived in ways that felt almost unreal after the brutal drought. The grass grew thick and green, the cattle fattened, and buyers continued to arrive, drawn by the growing reputation of Boone Ranch's exceptional breeding stock. But success brought its own problems. The neighboring rancher, a man named Garrett who ran the sprawling Double G spread to the east, started making noise about Elias's methods. He didn't like that the Boone Ranch was undercutting traditional markets. He didn't like that Clara, a woman, and a scandalous one at that according to town gossip, had so much influence over ranch operations. And he especially didn't like that Elias was succeeding where so many others had failed. "Garrett's been talking to people," Tom reported one afternoon, his weathered face troubled. "Saying you're running some kind of scheme, breeding weak cattle and selling them as premium stock." Elias's jaw tightened. "My cattle aren't weak. Anyone with eyes can see that." "He's not worried about the truth. He's worried about his own sales." Tom spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "He's losing buyers to you, and he doesn't like it." "Let him complain," Clara said firmly. "Our reputation is built on results, not gossip." But Garrett wasn't content to just complain. 2 weeks later, one of Elias's buyers backed out of a major sale, citing concerns about the stock's legitimacy. Another buyer mentioned hearing rumors that the Boone Ranch's cattle were actually stolen from smaller spreads during the drought. The accusations were ridiculous and easily disproven, but mud thrown hard enough always leaves a stain. Elias wanted to ride over to the Double G and confront Garrett directly, but Clara talked him out of it. That's exactly what he wants, she said, catching his arm before he could storm out. He wants you to lose your temper and do something stupid so he can say you're unstable. Don't give him the satisfaction. So we just let him lie about us? No, we fight back with proof. Clara's eyes were hard. We document everything: bloodlines, breeding records, bills of sale, veterinary records. We make our operation so transparent that no one can question it. And then we invite every major buyer in the territory to come see for themselves. It was a bold move, and a risky one. If they opened their books and their operation to scrutiny and something went wrong, they'd lose everything. But Clara believed in what they'd built, and more importantly, she believed in Elias. The inspection day arrived with perfect weather and a dozen skeptical ranchers who'd heard Garrett's rumors and wanted to see if there was any truth to them. Elias and Clara walked them through every aspect of the operation, answered every question, and showed them records that proved beyond doubt that the Boone Ranch's success was built on hard work and smart breeding, not deception. By the end of the day, half of the visiting ranchers had placed orders. 3 of them asked Clara for advice on improving their own breeding programs. And one older cattleman pulled Elias aside and said bluntly, "Garrett's a fool and a liar. Don't let him run you off. This territory needs more ranchers like you." That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Clara found Elias sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkening valley. "You all right?" she asked, settling beside him. "Yeah." Elias took her hand, threading their fingers together. "I was just thinking about how different things are now compared to a year ago. How different I am." "How so?" "A year ago, I was barely surviving. I was alone and angry and convinced I was going to fail just like everyone expected me to." He looked at her, his expression open in a way it rarely was. "Then you showed up, 1 penny short of bread and too proud to beg, and you changed everything." Clara felt her throat tighten. "I didn't change anything. I just helped." "You did more than help. You gave me a reason to fight for something bigger than just survival." Elias reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You made me believe that maybe I deserved something good." "You do deserve something good," Clara said fiercely. "You deserve all of it: success and respect and a future that doesn't feel like you're drowning every day." "So do you." They sat together in the gathering darkness. 2 people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built something neither of them had expected. The ranch was thriving, their partnership was strong, and the love between them felt as solid as the ground beneath their feet. But Clara knew, they both knew, that success had made them visible, and visibility attracted attention they might not want. Garrett's lies had been defeated, but his resentment hadn't gone anywhere. Other ranchers watched their rise with a mixture of admiration and envy, and the town of Blackstone Ridge still whispered about the seamstress and the rancher who'd scandalized everyone by living and working together without the benefit of marriage. That last thought stuck in Clara's mind as the summer wore on. She and Elias had never discussed marriage, not directly. Their relationship had evolved naturally from employer and employee to partners to lovers without anyone formally defining what they were to each other. It worked because they both understood what they'd built together, and neither of them needed a ceremony to validate it. But Clara was also practical enough to know that the world didn't work that way. Unmarried women living with men were always suspect, always vulnerable to gossip and judgment that could damage not just their reputations, but their livelihoods. And if something happened to Elias, if he got injured or sick or worse, Clara would have no legal claim to the ranch they'd built together. She'd be back where she started, 1 penny short and scrambling to survive. She didn't bring it up because she didn't want Elias to think she was angling for security or trying to trap him into something he didn't want. But the thought lingered, a small knot of worry that she couldn't quite ignore. The decision got made for her in August, when Garrett struck again. This time he didn't spread rumors. He went straight to the territorial land office and filed a water rights dispute, claiming that the Boone Ranch was diverting more than its legal share of creek water and damaging his downstream access. It was a calculated attack designed to tie them up in legal battles and drain their resources fighting bureaucratic nonsense. And it was devastatingly effective. The land agent showed up unannounced on a sweltering afternoon, a thin man with a clipboard and an officious manner who informed Elias that until the dispute was resolved, he couldn't make any changes to his water usage or infrastructure. "This is insane," Elias said, struggling to keep his temper. I've been using this water the same way my father did for 30 years. Garrett doesn't have a legitimate complaint. He's just trying to cause problems. That may be true, Mr. Boone, but I still have to investigate. The hearing is scheduled for October. The agent consulted his clipboard. In the meantime, I'll need to see all your water usage records and survey your irrigation setup. Clara stepped forward. Who filed this complaint? I'm not at liberty to... It was Garrett, Clara said flatly. We know it was Garrett. What we need to know is what proof he provided to justify this investigation. The agent looked uncomfortable. He claims your ranch is using water from a disputed tributary. Which tributary? The one running through the eastern boundary of your property. Clara and Elias exchanged glances. That tributary has always been part of this ranch, Elias said slowly. It's on our deed. Mr. Garrett claims the boundary was surveyed incorrectly and the tributary actually falls on shared land. The agent shifted his weight. Like I said, it'll all be sorted out at the hearing. Until then, try not to make any changes that might complicate things. After he left, Clara and Elias stood in the yard, both of them trying to process what had just happened. He's going after the water, Elias said finally. If he can prove the tributary is shared land, he can cut off half our access. He can't prove it because it's not true. Clara's mind was already racing. But he doesn't need to prove it. He just needs to drag this out long enough to cost us time and money and create enough doubt that buyers start looking elsewhere. So what do we do? Clara took a breath. We get married. Elias stared at her. What? We get married, Clara repeated, her voice steadier now. Today, tomorrow, as soon as possible. Clara, I'm not proposing out of strategy. Is she, I know you're not. Clara grabbed his hands. But listen to me. Right now, I have no legal standing. If something happens to you, if this dispute goes badly, if Garrett finds another way to attack, I lose everything because I'm not your wife. I'm just the hired help who happens to share your bed, and that makes me vulnerable, which makes us vulnerable. Elias's expression shifted as he understood what she was saying. You want to get married to protect yourself. I want to get married because I love you and because we're stronger together than apart in every possible way. Emotionally, practically, legally. Clara stepped closer. I'm not asking you to marry me because of Garrett or the ranch or any of that. I'm asking because I want to be your partner in every sense of the word, and I'm tired of pretending that's not what we already are. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of cattle and wind. Then Elias pulled her close and kissed her hard. Yes, he said when they broke apart. Yes, let's get married. Not because of Garrett or water rights or protecting the ranch, though those are good reasons, but because you're right. We're already partners in everything that matters. They rode into Blackstone Ridge the next day and got married in the land agent's office with Tom as their witness and a startled clerk recording the marriage license. It wasn't romantic or ceremonial. There were no flowers or guests or celebration, just two people making a legal commitment that reflected the emotional one they'd already made months ago. When they walked out of that office as husband and wife, Clara felt something shift inside her. Not a change in how she felt about Elias, but a change in how she saw herself. She wasn't Clara Whitmore anymore, scrambling to survive with 7 cents and a stubborn refusal to beg. She was Clara Boone, co-owner of a thriving ranch, partner to a man she loved and respected, and a woman who'd fought her way back from nothing and won. The town noticed, of course. The gossip shifted overnight from scandalous cohabitation to grudging acceptance. Some people were genuinely happy for them. Others were disappointed to lose their favorite source of speculation. And a few, like Garrett, were furious because the marriage legitimized everything Clara and Elias had built together and made them even harder to tear apart. The water rights hearing happened in October as scheduled, and it went exactly the way Clara had predicted. Garrett's case fell apart under scrutiny when the surveyor confirmed the original boundary markers, and the tributary was proven to be entirely on Boone land. The territorial agent ruled in Elias's favor, ordered Garrett to pay the investigation costs, and warned him against filing frivolous complaints in the future. It should have been a complete victory, but Clara saw the look on Garrett's face when the ruling came down, and she knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over. They'd won the battle, but the war was just beginning. Garrett didn't wait long to make his next move. 2 weeks after the hearing, Elias came back from checking the northern fence line to find 3 of his breeding bulls missing. Not wandering, not lost, missing. The fence had been cut clean through with wire cutters, and the tracks leading away were deliberate, heading straight toward Double G territory. "He stole them," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet as he stood in the barn with Clara and Tom. "He cut my fence and drove off 3 of my best bulls." Tom spat into the dirt. "Can't prove it was him." "I don't need proof to know." Elias turned toward the door. "I'm riding over there right now." Clara stepped in front of him. "No, you're not." "Get out of my way, Clara." "Not a chance." She planted her feet. "You ride over to the Double G and accuse Garrett of theft without proof, and you give him exactly what he wants, an excuse to claim you're unstable and violent. He'll twist it into you threatening him, and suddenly you're the problem, not the missing bulls." "So I just let him steal from me?" "No. We report it to the marshal and let him handle it." Clara grabbed Elias's arm when he tried to move past her. "I know you're angry. I'm angry too. But we do this the right way, or we hand Garrett ammunition to destroy us." The muscle in Elias's jaw ticked. "The marshal is Garrett's cousin." "Then we go over his head. We file a formal complaint with the territorial office and make enough noise that they can't ignore it." Clara's grip tightened. "But you don't go over there alone and you don't make threats. Promise me." Elias stared at her for a long moment, the anger radiating off him like heat. Then he exhaled roughly and nodded. "Fine. We do it your way." They rode into Blackstone Ridge that afternoon and filed a theft report with Marshal Dawson, who listened with a bored expression and wrote down the details with the speed of a man who had no intention of acting on them. "I'll look into it," he said, not meeting Elias's eyes. "But cattle wander sometimes. Could be they just broke through on their own." "The fence was cut," Elias said flatly. "Could have been cut after they wandered through. Hard to say." Dawson closed his notebook. "I'll ride out and take a look when I get a chance." Outside, Clara stopped Elias before he could mount his horse. "We need another plan. I'm open to suggestions that don't involve me strangling Garrett with my bare hands." Clara almost smiled despite the situation. "We hire a lawyer, someone from outside Blackstone Ridge who doesn't owe Garrett any favors. We document everything, the cut fence, the missing bulls, the timing, right after we won the water rights case. We build a case so solid that even a corrupt marshal can't ignore it. Lawyers cost money. So does letting Garrett steal from us with impunity." Clara met his eyes. "We spent the drought building a reputation for quality stock. Those bulls are worth more than their sale price. They're proof of our breeding program. If we let this go, we're telling everyone that we're easy targets." Elias nodded slowly. "You're right. Find us a lawyer." The lawyer Clara found was a sharp-eyed woman from Silver Creek named Margaret Hayes, who had a reputation for winning cases that everyone else considered unwinnable. She rode out to the ranch 3 days later, surveyed the cut fence, examined the tracks, and took detailed notes while Clara and Elias walked her through everything that had happened since Garrett first started making trouble. "This is harassment with a clear pattern," Margaret said, flipping through her notes. "The rumors, the water rights dispute, and now theft. He's trying to drive you out of business." "Can you prove it?" Elias asked. "Not yet, but I can make enough trouble for him that he'll think twice about doing it again." Margaret looked between them. "This won't be quick, and it won't be cheap. Are you prepared for that?" "We're prepared," Clara said firmly. What followed was 3 months of legal maneuvering that drained their savings and tested their patience in ways the drought never had. Margaret was relentless, filing motions and demanding investigations and making Garrett's life difficult at every turn. The missing bulls were never recovered. Garrett had probably sold them across the territorial line where they couldn't be traced. But Margaret made sure everyone in the territory knew what had happened and who was responsible. The cost was brutal, but the message was clear. The boons weren't going to be pushed around. By January, Garrett had backed off, though Clara knew it was temporary. Men like him didn't forget humiliation, and they didn't forgive losses. He'd wait, and he'd watch, and he'd strike again when they least expected it. But they'd bought themselves time, and time was exactly what they needed. Winter settled over the ranch with a cold that felt different from previous years. Clara stood at the kitchen window one morning, watching snow fall in thick curtains across the valley, and felt an unfamiliar churning in her stomach that had nothing to do with worry about the weather. She'd been feeling off for weeks, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, nauseated at odd times, emotional over things that normally wouldn't bother her. She'd written it off as stress from the legal battles and the constant tension with Garrett, but this morning, watching the snow fall while her stomach rolled, Clara finally admitted what she'd been avoiding. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the counter and tried to process it, tried to separate the fear from the hope, the practicality from the emotion. A baby. She and Elias were going to have a baby. She didn't tell him right away. She needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how this changed everything they'd been building. They were still fighting legal battles and dealing with Garrett's harassment and trying to keep the ranch profitable in a market that remained unpredictable. Adding a baby to that chaos felt overwhelming. But that night, lying in bed with Elias's arm around her and the wind howling outside, Clara realized she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly into the darkness. Elias went absolutely still. Then he sat up and lit the lamp, his expression stunned. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions too fast for Clara to track. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "We're having a baby," he said, his voice rough. "Are you—" Clara pulled back to look at him. "Are you happy about it? Because I know the timing isn't great and we've got so much going on, and I don't want you to feel like—" "Clara." Elias cupped her face in his hands. "I'm terrified and thrilled and completely unprepared, and yes, I'm happy. I'm so damn happy I can barely think straight." Relief flooded through her. "I'm terrified too." "Good. We can be terrified together." Elias kissed her forehead. "When?" "July, I think. Maybe early August." "We have time then. Time to prepare, time to figure things out." He pulled her close again. "We'll make it work, Clara. We always do." They told Tom the next morning, and the old man's weathered face split into a rare grin. "About damn time. This place needs some young blood." "The baby won't be much help with the cattle for a few years," Elias pointed out, amused. "Doesn't matter. A ranch is meant to be passed down, not worked until it dies with you." Tom clapped Elias on the shoulder. "Your daddy would be proud." The pregnancy changed Clara in ways she hadn't expected. She'd always been driven and focused, pouring everything into the ranch and the business, but now there was something else competing for her attention. She found herself thinking about the future in concrete terms. What kind of life they were building, what kind of world they were bringing a child into, what legacy they wanted to leave behind. It made her bolder. In February, Clara proposed something that made Elias think she'd lost her mind entirely. "We should help the struggling ranchers," she said over dinner one night. Elias set down his fork. "Come again?" "The ranchers who are barely surviving, the ones who lost everything in the drought and are one bad season away from going under." Clara leaned forward. "We help them." "With what? We're not exactly rolling in surplus cash after paying Margaret's fees." "Not with money. With knowledge." Clara pulled out the notes she'd been working on all afternoon. "We teach them what we learned about drought-resistant breeding, water conservation, selective culling. We share our methods. We help them rebuild." "Why would we do that? They're our competition." "Right now they're not competition. They're barely surviving. But if we help them get stable, if we create a network of ranchers who all use better practices and produce higher quality stock, we raise the reputation of the entire region." Clara tapped her notes. "Buyers don't just want good cattle. They want reliable sources. If Blackstone Ridge becomes known as the place where every ranch produces quality stock, we all benefit." Elias shook his head slowly. "You want to give away our competitive advantage." "I want to build something bigger than one ranch. I want to create a community that's strong enough to survive the next drought, the next market crash, the next disaster." Clara's voice was fierce. "And I want our child to grow up in a place where people help each other instead of tearing each other down." "Garrett won't like it." "Garrett can go to hell. I'm tired of letting him dictate what we do." Clara met Elias's eyes. "We have a choice. We can keep fighting small battles and protecting what's ours, or we can build something so big and strong that Garrett's schemes don't matter anymore. What do you want to do?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to build something bigger. Let's do it." They started small, inviting 3 neighboring ranchers to the Boone Ranch for a weekend workshop. Clara and Elias walked them through their breeding records, explained their selection criteria, and demonstrated their water management techniques. They answered questions, shared failures as readily as successes, and sent their guests home with detailed notes and an open invitation to come back anytime. Word spread. Within 2 months, they were hosting monthly workshops that drew ranchers from across the territory. Some came skeptical and left converts. Others came desperate and left with hope. A few came looking for handouts and left disappointed. Clara was generous with knowledge, not charity. Garrett watched it all with growing fury. He tried to convince other ranchers that the Boones were running some kind of scheme, but his accusations fell flat when the proof was right there in improved cattle and better yields. He spread rumors that Elias and Clara were bankrupting themselves with this foolish charity, but the ranch's financial records told a different story. The truth was that helping others had strengthened the Boones' position, not weakened it. Ranchers who learned from them became loyal customers for breeding stock. The regional reputation grew, attracting buyers from farther away who were willing to pay premium prices. And the network of ranchers they'd trained became an informal alliance that shared information and supported each other through hard times. It was exactly what Clara had envisioned, and it was working. But success made them even more visible, and visibility attracted danger. In March, Clara was in town buying supplies when she overheard a conversation between 2 men she didn't recognize. They were standing outside the saloon, speaking in low voices that carried just far enough for her to catch fragments. Garrett says the Boone place is ripe for the taking. Too much land for 2 people and an old man to defend. Wait until after the baby comes. Easier targets. Clara's blood ran cold. She moved closer, pretending to examine the goods in the store window, straining to hear more. But the men noticed her and stopped talking, eyeing her with expressions that made her skin crawl. She finished her shopping quickly and rode back to the ranch faster than was probably safe for a pregnant woman. Elias was in the barn when she arrived, and one look at her face had him dropping the tools he was holding. What happened? Clara told him about the conversation she'd overheard, watching his expression darken with every word. He's planning something, Elias said quietly. Something worse than theft or legal games. We need to be ready. Clara's hand instinctively went to her growing belly. We need to hire more hands, people we can trust, and we need to let the other ranchers know what Garrett's planning. If we accuse him without proof, there are some... I'm not talking about accusations. I'm talking about being prepared. Clara's voice was steady despite the fear curling in her chest. We tell people we're hiring for extra security because we've heard rumors of rustlers in the area. We make it clear that the Boone Ranch isn't an easy target, and we watch our backs. They hired 2 ranch hands that week, both men recommended by ranchers they'd trained. They also quietly spread the word among their network about increased rustler activity, which wasn't technically a lie. Garrett was essentially planning to rustle their entire operation if given the chance. Spring arrived with warm winds and the promise of new growth. Clara's belly swelled with the baby, and she had to modify her work to accommodate her changing body. She could no longer ride out to the pastures or haul water or do any of the physical labor that had been part of her daily routine, and the forced inactivity made her restless and irritable. I feel useless, she complained to Elias one evening. You're growing a human being. That's not useless. Elias placed his hand on her belly, his expression softening when he felt the baby kick. Besides, you're still running half this ranch from the kitchen table. Don't pretend you're not working. It's not the same. No, it's harder. You're doing 3 jobs at once, managing the business, preparing for the baby, and keeping me from doing something stupid every time Garrett pisses me off. Elias kissed her temple. Give yourself some credit. Clara leaned into him, letting herself take comfort in his solid presence. She'd spent so much of her life proving she didn't need anyone, fighting to stay independent and self-sufficient. But pregnancy had forced her to accept help, to acknowledge her limitations, to trust Elias and the people around her to carry weight she couldn't manage alone. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. In May, the thing Clara had been dreading finally happened. Elias came back from town with news that made her stomach drop. Garrett's selling the Double G, he said, his expression grim. Clara looked up from the accounts she'd been reviewing. What? He's selling the ranch, putting the whole operation up for auction next month. Elias sank into a chair. I heard it from 3 different people, so it's not just rumor. Why would he sell? That ranch has been in his family for generations. I don't know, but I don't trust it. Elias dragged a hand through his hair. This feels like another move in whatever game he's playing. Clara's mind raced through possibilities. Who's buying it? That's the thing. It's an open auction. Anyone can bid. They looked at each other, the same thought occurring to both of them simultaneously. We could buy it, Clara said slowly. With what money? We're doing well, but we don't have double G money. We could get investors. We've built enough of a reputation that banks would listen to us now. Clara stood and started pacing, her mind already working through the logistics. If we buy the double G, we control the water access, the grazing land, everything Garrett's been using to threaten us. We eliminate the threat entirely. Or we overextend ourselves trying to manage twice the land with a baby on the way and end up losing everything. Elias shook his head. It's too risky. Everything we've done has been risky. Getting married was risky. Helping other ranchers was risky. Fighting Garrett instead of rolling over was risky. Clara stopped in front of him. But we're still here, and we're stronger than we've ever been. We can do this. You really believe that? I do. But I need you to believe it too. Elias stood and pulled her close, careful of her belly between them. I believe in you. I believe in us. If you think we can make this work, then we'll find a way. They spent the next 3 weeks preparing. Clara drafted a business proposal that laid out exactly how they'd finance the purchase and integrate the two ranches. Elias met with potential investors, including several of the ranchers they'd trained who saw the value in having the Boones control more territory. And together they calculated and recalculated the numbers until they were certain they could make it work. The auction was set for mid-June. Clara was 8 months pregnant and moving slowly, but she insisted on attending. Elias tried to argue, but one look at her face told him it would be a losing battle. The auction took place in the Blackstone Ridge Town Hall on a sweltering afternoon. The room was packed with ranchers, speculators, and curious townspeople who wanted to see what would happen. Garrett sat in the front row, his expression unreadable. The auctioneer started the bidding at a price that made several people in the room wince. Clara and Elias had anticipated that, and they came prepared. When Elias raised his hand to bid, a ripple of surprise went through the crowd. The bidding went back and forth, climbing higher and higher. Clara watched the other bidders drop out one by one as the price climbed past what most people could afford. It came down to Elias and one other bidder, a well-dressed man from out of territory that Clara didn't recognize. At $10,000, the stranger raised his hand again. Elias looked at Clara. They'd agreed on a ceiling of $9,000, the absolute maximum they could afford, even with investor backing. Going higher would be gambling everything. Clara met his eyes and nodded once. $11,000, Elias said clearly. The room went dead silent. The stranger studied Elias for a long moment, then shook his head and sat back. The auctioneer called for any other bids, got nothing, and brought his gavel down. Sold to Elias Boone for $11,000. The crowd erupted in noise, some people congratulating them, others looking shocked, Garrett's expression twisting into something ugly before he schooled it back to neutrality. Clara felt Elias's hand find hers under the table and squeeze tight. They'd done it. They'd just bought the Double G Ranch and everything that came with it. Walking out of that town hall, Clara felt the enormity of what they'd committed to settle over her like a weight. They'd just taken on massive debt, doubled their workload, and made themselves the largest ranching operation in the territory, all while preparing for a baby who would arrive in less than 2 months. It was either the smartest thing they'd ever done or the most catastrophic mistake, and they wouldn't know which for years. That night, lying in bed while Elias slept beside her, Clara felt the baby kick hard against her ribs. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered to the child she hadn't met yet, "Your father and I just bet everything we have on the future. I hope you're worth it." The baby kicked again, as if in answer. 2 weeks after the auction, Clara went into labor on a Tuesday morning while reviewing fence repair estimates. Her water broke all over the kitchen floor, and for a moment she just stood there, staring at the puddle and thinking absurdly that she'd just mopped yesterday. Then the first contraction hit, and everything else became irrelevant. Elias was in the north pasture surveying the newly acquired Double G land. Tom rode out to get him, while Clara gripped the edge of the kitchen table and tried to remember how to breathe. The midwife wouldn't arrive from town for at least 2 hours, and the contractions were already coming faster than Clara had expected. By the time Elias burst through the door, wild-eyed and panicked, Clara was on her hands and knees in the bedroom, sweating and swearing through another contraction.
"Where's the midwife?" he demanded. "Not here yet," Clara gasped. "You might have to—" Another contraction cut off her words. "I am not delivering this baby. I know how to birth calves, not children." "They're not that different." "Clara, I swear. Just stay with me," she said, reaching for his hand. "I'm scared, and I need you here."
Elias's expression softened. He knelt beside her and took her hand, letting her squeeze hard enough to cut off his circulation. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The midwife arrived 20 minutes later, by which point Clara was fairly certain she was going to die. She'd helped birth calves and foals, watched animals go through labor, and thought she understood what it entailed. She'd been catastrophically wrong. Labor was brutal and exhausting, and nothing like she'd imagined. It went on for hours, contractions ripping through her in waves that left her gasping and crying and begging for it to be over. Elias stayed beside her the entire time, letting her curse at him and grip his hand and generally blame him for putting her in this situation. "Never again," she panted between contractions. "We are never doing this again." "Whatever you say," Elias agreed, looking nearly as pale as she felt. When the baby finally came, slipping into the world with a furious wail, Clara was too exhausted to do anything but cry. The midwife cleaned the infant and placed her on Clara's chest, a daughter, tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. "She's beautiful," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's angry," Clara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Listen to those lungs." Their daughter, they named her Sarah, after Elias's mother, was indeed angry. She screamed for the first hour of her life, then abruptly fell asleep mid-wail and stayed asleep for 4 hours straight. Clara dozed in exhausted fits while Elias sat in the chair beside the bed, staring at his daughter like he couldn't quite believe she was real. "We have a baby," he said wonderingly. "We have a baby and $11,000 of debt and 2 ranches to run," Clara pointed out. What were we thinking? That we could handle anything as long as we were together. Elias looked at her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way it rarely was. Were we wrong? Clara looked at Sarah's tiny sleeping face, then at Elias's exhausted but hopeful expression, then around the room they'd built together in the house they'd saved from collapse. "No," she said quietly. "We weren't wrong. We're going to be fine." She almost believed it. The first month with Sarah was chaos. The baby cried constantly, slept in random intervals that bore no relationship to day or night, and demanded feeding every 2 hours with a tyrannical insistence that left Clara feeling like a milk-producing automaton. She was exhausted in a way that made the drought year feel like a pleasant vacation, and there were moments when she seriously questioned every decision that had led to this point. But there were also moments, quiet ones in the deep night, when Sarah finally settled and Clara held her close, when she felt something she'd never experienced before. Not just love, though it was fierce and overwhelming, but belonging. Like all the scattered, broken pieces of her life had finally found their place. Elias threw himself into managing both ranches with an intensity that worried Clara when she had the energy to worry about anything beyond keeping Sarah alive. He was gone from dawn until well after dark most days, coordinating crews, moving cattle, repairing infrastructure on the double G that Garrett had let deteriorate. He came home exhausted and fell into bed only to be woken hours later by Sarah's crying. Neither of them complained. They'd chosen this path, and they'd see it through. By August, they'd settled into something resembling a routine. Sarah's sleep schedule was still unpredictable, but at least she had a schedule. The double G integration was proceeding, though slower than they'd hoped. And the first mortgage payment was due in September. That's when they discovered why Garrett had sold. Tom brought the news, riding in from town with an expression that made Clara's stomach drop even before he spoke. "There's a problem with the water rights on the double G." Elias looked up from the fence he was repairing. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where Garrett filed a claim on the main creek 2 days before the auction, and it just got approved by the territorial office." Tom spat into the dirt. "He doesn't own the land anymore, but he owns the water rights, and he's planning to sell them to the highest bidder." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Elias very carefully set down his tools and walked into the house without a word. Clara found him in the study, staring at the maps of both properties spread across the desk. "He planned this," Elias said quietly. He sold us the ranch knowing we'd need that water to make it profitable, and now he's going to either extort us for access or sell the rights to someone who will. Clara felt a cold fury settle over her. Can he do that legally? Apparently he already did. Then we fight it. We hire Margaret again. We challenge the claim. With what money, Clara? Elias's voice was strained. We're stretched thin as it is. One more legal battle might break us. Then we find another way. Clara moved to stand beside him, Sarah asleep in her arms. We didn't come this far to let Garrett win now. Elias looked at her, then at their sleeping daughter, then back at the maps. What if there's no other way? What if we made a mistake so big we can't recover from it? Then we try anyway, Clara said fiercely. Because giving up isn't who we are. It's not who I fell in love with, and it's not who I want our daughter to see when she's old enough to understand what her parents built. Something shifted in Elias's expression. He straightened, the defeat leaving his shoulders. You're right. We fight. Damn right we fight. They fought with everything they had. Margaret Hayes listened to their problem with the focused intensity of a predator sizing up prey. She sat at the Boone kitchen table, Sarah fussing in Clara's arms, while Elias paced and explained Garrett's water rights scheme. He filed the claim before the auction, Margaret repeated, tapping her pencil against her notebook. That means he knew exactly what he was doing. He sold you land he'd already made worthless. Can we challenge it? Clara asked. We can try, but water rights claims are complicated, and if the territorial office already approved it, they're not going to want to admit they made a mistake. Margaret flipped through her notes. How long can you survive without access to that creek? Elias and Clara exchanged glances. 3 months, Elias said. Maybe 4 if we're lucky and it doesn't get too hot. After that, the double G cattle will start dying. Then we have 3 months to figure this out. Margaret closed her notebook. I'll file a challenge and see what I can dig up about how Garrett got that claim approved so fast. Someone greased palms somewhere, and if I can prove it, we might have a case. After she left, Clara fed Sarah while Elias stared out the window at the valley that now felt more like a trap than an empire. We can't afford to pay her for another 3 months of legal work, he said quietly. I know. And even if we win, Garrett will just find another way to sabotage us. He's not going to stop until we're ruined or dead. Clara shifted Sarah to her other side, wincing at the familiar discomfort. Then we need to make him stop. How? I don't know yet, but there has to be something he wants more than revenge. Clara looked down at Sarah's tiny face, peaceful now that she was feeding. Everyone has a price. We just need to find his. The answer came from an unexpected source 2 weeks later. Tom rode in from town with news that made Clara's eyes narrow with calculation. Garrett's broke, Tom announced, dismounting stiffly. Heard it from 3 different folks at Hutchins' store. He sold the double G because he had to, not because he wanted to. Man's got gambling debts from here to Silver Creek, and the people he owes aren't the patient type. Clara looked at Elias. That's it. That's what we use. Use how? We buy the water rights from him. Clara stood, passing Sarah to Elias. If he needs money badly enough, he'll sell. And if we own both the land and the water, we eliminate the threat entirely. We can't afford to buy water rights on top of everything else. Not alone, but what about the ranchers we've been training? Clara was already moving toward the study, her mind racing. They all benefit from having stable neighbors. If we pool resources, create a cooperative ownership structure where multiple ranches share the water rights, we can afford it. And they get security too. Elias followed her, Sarah starting to fuss again in his arms. You want to convince a dozen ranchers to invest in a cooperative based on nothing but trust? Based on the fact that we've already proven we keep our word and we help the people who help us. Clara pulled out paper and started sketching a proposal. We're not asking for charity. We're offering them a stake in something bigger than one ranch's survival. Garrett's going to demand an outrageous price. Probably. But he's also desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. Clara looked up at Elias. We've been playing defense since we bought the double G. It's time we went on offense. They spent the next week visiting every rancher in their network, laying out the problem and the proposed solution. Some were immediately on board. Others needed convincing. A few flat out refused, seeing it as too risky or too much trust in neighbors who might turn on them. But by the end of the week, Clara had commitments from 8 ranches representing enough pooled capital to make a serious offer. It wasn't quite what Garrett would demand, but it was close enough to negotiate. The hard part was approaching Garrett himself. They found him at the Blackstone Ridge Saloon on a Saturday afternoon, drinking alone at a corner table. He looked up when they approached, his expression souring immediately. "Come to gloat?" he asked. "No." Clara pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. Elias remained standing, his presence a silent wall of support. "We came to make you an offer." Garrett laughed bitterly. "I've got nothing left to sell you. You already bought my ranch." "You have the water rights. We want to buy them." His eyes sharpened. "Do you now? And what makes you think I'm selling?" "Because you need money, and we have it." Clara kept her voice level. "We know about your debts, Garrett. We know you're in trouble, so let's stop playing games and negotiate like adults." For a moment, Garrett looked like he might throw his drink in her face. Then he leaned back in his chair, studying them both. "Even if I was interested, which I'm not saying I am, what makes you think you can afford what those rights are worth?" "We have investors, 8 ranches pooling resources to create a water cooperative." Clara pulled out the proposal she'd drafted. "We're offering $7,000, paid in full within 30 days. Garrett barely glanced at the papers. "The rights are worth $15,000 minimum, to someone who can afford to wait for a buyer. You don't have that luxury." Clara met his eyes. $7,000 clears most of your immediate debts and gets the dangerous people off your back. What happens after that is your problem, but at least you'll be alive to deal with it. You don't know anything about my situation. I know more than you think. I also know that if you refuse this offer and try to hold out for more, we'll tie you up in legal challenges until you're forced to sell for even less, or until your creditors come collecting in ways that don't involve lawyers." Clara's voice was cold. $7,000, Garrett. Take it or leave it." The silence stretched out, broken only by the ambient noise of the saloon. Garrett's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter, his hands clenched around his glass. "I built that ranch," he said finally, his voice tight. 30 years of my life, and you two waltz in and take it like it's nothing. You and your schemes and your pretty words about community. You're just thieves with better manners. We're ranchers trying to survive, same as you were." Elias spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We didn't set out to destroy you, Garrett. We just refused to let you destroy us." "That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make you think about what happens next." Elias pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "You can keep hating us and keep fighting and end up with nothing. Or you can take our money, pay your debts, and start over somewhere else. Maybe somewhere without people who know what you tried to do to us." Garrett stared at him, then at Clara, then down at his empty glass. When he looked up again, the fight had gone out of his eyes, replaced by something that looked like exhaustion. $10,000, he said. "Not a penny less." Clara didn't hesitate. $8,500. That's our final offer, and it's more than fair." "Final offer? You're in no position to fix them." "Yes, we are," Clara leaned forward. "Because we both know that if you push this, we'll make your life hell. We'll drag out every legal challenge, expose every shady deal you made to get those rights approved, and make sure everyone in the territory knows you tried to commit fraud. Your reputation is already damaged. We can destroy it completely." Garrett's face darkened, but he didn't argue. The truth was written in every line of his expression. He was beaten, and he knew it. $8,500, he said finally. "And you never speak to me again." "Deal." They shook hands like combatants acknowledging a truce neither of them liked, and Clara felt something unknot in her chest. It wasn't victory, exactly. They'd paid far more than the water rights were worth just to eliminate a threat that never should have existed. But it was survival, and survival was enough. The transfer of water rights took 3 weeks to complete, during which time Clara organized the cooperative structure that would govern shared ownership among the participating ranches. It was complicated work, requiring agreements and bylaws and structures that satisfied everyone's concerns about fairness and control. "You should have been a lawyer," Margaret said admiringly when Clara showed her the final documents. "This is better than half the contracts I've seen from actual attorneys. I just don't want anyone claiming later that they were cheated or that the terms weren't clear." Clara bounced Sarah on her hip, the baby finally content after a morning of fussing. "We're building something that needs to outlast all of us.
That means it has to be fair and transparent. Well, you've accomplished that. Margaret gathered her papers. I'll file these with the territorial office tomorrow. By next week, you'll officially own those water rights as a cooperative.
After Margaret left, Elias found Clara standing on the porch, staring out at the valley with Sarah asleep against her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked, wrapping his arms around them both. "I'm tired," Clara admitted. "Tired of fighting, tired of constantly watching our backs, tired of sacrificing everything we earn just to keep what we've built. We won, though. Garrett's gone, the water is secure, and the ranches are stable. For now. But there's always going to be another Garrett, another drought, another disaster." Clara turned to look at him. "I don't regret any of it. Not marrying you, not buying the double G, not creating the cooperative. But sometimes I wonder if we'll ever get to just live instead of constantly surviving." Elias was quiet for a moment, his hand gentle on Sarah's back. "My father used to say that ranching wasn't about reaching some point where the work stopped. It was about building something strong enough to withstand whatever came next." He kissed Clara's temple. "We've done that. We've built something strong. Maybe that's enough." "Maybe," Clara said softly. That night she woke to Sarah crying and stumbled to the nursery in the dark, exhausted and sore and wishing desperately for a full night's sleep. She picked up her daughter and settled into the rocking chair, Sarah latching on immediately with the single-minded determination that characterized everything she did. In the dim lamplight, Clara studied her daughter's face and thought about everything they'd fought for. The ranch wasn't just land and cattle and water rights, it was this, a place where Sarah could grow up safe and loved, where she could learn that hard work mattered and integrity mattered and helping others made you stronger, not weaker. It was a legacy worth building, even if the cost was higher than Clara had ever imagined. By October, the cooperative was functioning smoothly and the combined ranches were showing profit for the first time since before the drought. The network of trained ranchers had grown to include nearly 20 operations, and the regional reputation for quality stock had attracted buyers from territories Clara had never even heard of. They were successful by any reasonable measure. They'd survived and thrived and built something genuinely impressive. But success brought visibility, and visibility brought complications. The territorial governor's office sent a representative in November to investigate reports of unusual cooperative arrangements among Blackstone Ridge ranchers. The representative was a narrow-faced bureaucrat named Simmons, who arrived with a stack of regulations and a suspicious mind. He spent 3 days touring ranches, examining books, and asking pointed questions about the water rights cooperative and the training network Clara had created. Elias was ready to throw him off the property by day 2, but Clara insisted they cooperate fully and transparently. "We have nothing to hide," she told Elias, while Simmons was examining their breeding records for the 3rd time. "Let him look. The more he sees, the more he'll realize we're doing everything legally. He's looking for a reason to shut us down. Then we make sure he doesn't find one." On the final day of his inspection, Simmons requested a meeting with Clara and Elias in the study. He sat across the desk from them, his expression unreadable, while Sarah played on a blanket in the corner. "I've completed my review," he began, steepling his fingers. "And I must say, what you've built here is highly irregular." Clara's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Irregular how?" "The cooperative structure, the information sharing, the coordinated breeding programs, none of this follows traditional ranching models." Simmons pulled out a document. "There are concerns in the territorial office that you're creating a monopoly that could control prices and squeeze out independent operators." "That's absurd," Elias said flatly. "We're helping independent operators survive and thrive. Half the ranchers in this cooperative would have gone under without the support network." "Perhaps, but the concentration of control is concerning." Simmons looked at Clara. "Particularly the fact that you, Mrs. Boone, seem to be the driving force behind most of these arrangements. A woman holding this much influence over regional commerce raises questions." Clara felt ice settle in her veins. So that was it. Not concern about monopolies or fairness, but discomfort with a woman wielding power. "I'm a rancher and a businesswoman," she said evenly. "My gender has nothing to do with my ability to organize cooperative structures or improve breeding programs. I'm not questioning your ability, I'm questioning the precedent." Simmons leaned forward. "What happens if other regions decide to follow your model? We could see women taking control of entire territorial economies. And that would be a problem because? Clara's voice was dangerously quiet. Because it's unprecedented, because it creates instability. Simmons gestured vaguely. The territorial government has a responsibility to maintain order and traditional structures of commerce. Elias stood abruptly. Get out. Excuse me? I said get out. We've cooperated with your inspection, answered your questions, shown you our books. We've done everything legally and above board. If you have actual violations to cite, cite them. Otherwise, get the hell off my property. Simmons stood as well, his face flushing. I could recommend that the territorial office dismantle your entire cooperative structure. You could try, Clara said, standing with Sarah in her arms. But you'd face lawsuits from 20 ranching families, all of whom have documentation proving they entered these agreements voluntarily and that they've benefited enormously. You'd also face questions about why the territorial government is suddenly interested in crushing successful cooperative ventures while doing nothing about the actual monopolies run by men. Are you threatening me, Mrs. Boone? I'm stating facts, Mr. Simmons. We're not breaking any laws, we're not hurting anyone, and we're actually improving the economic stability of this region. If you choose to make this a fight, and we'll win because we have the truth and the law on our side. Simmons stared at her for a long moment, clearly recalculating his approach. Then he gathered his papers and headed for the door. I'll be making my report to the governor's office. I suggest you prepare for further scrutiny. After he left, Elias pulled Clara close, Sarah between them. That was either brilliant or we just made a very powerful enemy. Both, probably. Clara rested her head on his shoulder. But I'm tired of letting people try to tear down what we've built just because they don't like that a woman had a hand in building it. More than a hand. You built most of this. We built it together. That's what scares them. Not that I'm a woman with influence, but that we've proven you don't need their traditional structures to succeed. Clara pulled back to look at him. Whatever Simmons reports, whatever the territorial office does, we face it the same way we've faced everything else. Together. Exactly. The threatened scrutiny never materialized. 2 weeks later, they received a terse letter from the territorial office stating that the Blackstone Ridge cooperative arrangements had been reviewed and found to be in compliance with all relevant regulations. No further action would be taken. Clara suspected that Margaret had made some strategic calls to people who owed her favors, but she never asked. Sometimes it was better not to know exactly how victory was achieved. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow in November that stayed on the ground through January. It was a hard season that tested the cooperative's resources and Clara's patience with being constantly cold while caring for a baby who seemed to delight in spitting up on every clean dress Clara owned. But it was also strangely peaceful. With Garrett gone and the territorial investigation resolved, there were no immediate crises demanding their attention. They could focus on the work itself, cattle, land, family, and the quiet satisfaction of building something that would last. Sarah took her first steps in February, lurching across the kitchen floor into Elias's waiting arms with a shriek of delight. Clara watched from the doorway, exhausted from a sleepless night but smiling despite it, and thought about how far they'd come from that dusty general store where she'd been 1 penny short of bread. By spring, the combined ranches were thriving in ways that exceeded even Clara's optimistic projections. The breeding program was producing cattle that buyers fought over. The cooperative had expanded to include 23 ranches, and the regional reputation had grown to the point where Blackstone Ridge stock was becoming synonymous with quality throughout the territory. They were successful. Genuinely, undeniably successful. But success came with its own burdens. The larger they grew, the more people depended on them. The more visible they became, the more scrutiny they attracted. And the more they built, the more they had to lose. Clara felt that weight every day as she balanced account books while Sarah played at her feet, as she made decisions that affected not just their ranch but 23 others, as she navigated the delicate politics of cooperative leadership while fighting the constant undercurrent of skepticism about a woman in that role. Some days it felt like too much, like she was one crisis away from everything collapsing despite all their careful planning and hard work. But then she'd look at Sarah, now a year old and full of fierce determination and her father's stubborn streak, and she'd remember why they were doing this, not just for themselves, but for the future they wanted their daughter to inherit. In June, they hosted the cooperative's annual meeting, bringing together representatives from all member ranches to review the year's performance and plan for the future. Clara had organized the agenda meticulously, prepared detailed reports, and arranged for enough food to feed an army. The meeting was held in the newly renovated barn on the Double G property, which they'd converted into a community gathering space. Ranchers arrived from across the region, some traveling for days to attend. Clara stood at the front of the room with Sarah on her hip and watched the crowd settle. These were men and women who'd been struggling or failing just 2 years ago. Now they were prosperous, confident, and united by the network she and Elias had helped create. "We've had a remarkable year," she began, her voice carrying across the barn. "Every ranch in this cooperative has shown profit. We've weathered market fluctuations, dry conditions, and increased competition, and we've come out stronger. That's not luck. That's the result of hard work, smart breeding practices, and the mutual support we provide each other." She walked them through the financial reports, the breeding statistics, the expansion plans. She fielded questions and concerns with the same calm competence she brought to everything. And when the formal business was concluded, she made an announcement that she and Elias had been planning for months. "Starting this fall, we're going to offer an apprenticeship program. Young people who want to learn ranching can work on cooperative ranches for 2 years, learning everything from cattle management to business operations. When they complete the program, we'll help them get established with starter herds and access to land." The room erupted into discussion. Some ranchers loved the idea immediately. Others were skeptical about the cost and commitment. A few worried about training future competition. "This isn't about competition," Clara said, raising her voice to be heard. "It's about sustainability. The average age of ranchers in this territory is over 50. If we don't train the next generation, ranching dies with us. This program ensures that the knowledge and practices we've developed get passed down to people who'll carry them forward." An older rancher named Patterson stood. "And who's going to fund this program? Those apprentices aren't going to work for free." The cooperative will provide baseline funding, with each ranch contributing a small percentage of annual profits. Individual ranches can choose to host apprentices or not, but the program serves everyone by strengthening the overall industry. Clara met his eyes. "We're not asking anyone to give charity. We're asking everyone to invest in the future." The debate continued for another hour before they finally voted. The apprenticeship program passed by a narrow margin, with Clara promising to have detailed implementation plans ready by August. After the meeting, Elias found her standing outside the barn, Sarah asleep on her shoulder, watching the sunset over the valley. "You all right?" he asked. "Just thinking about what we've built." Clara leaned into him when he put his arm around her. 2 years ago, I was counting pennies for bread. Now I'm running cooperative meetings and creating apprenticeship programs. It doesn't seem real sometimes." "It's real. You made it real." Elias kissed the top of her head. "I know it's exhausting, and I know there are days you want to walk away from all of it. But you've changed this entire region, Clara. You've given people hope and stability and a future. That matters." "Does it? Sometimes I feel like I'm just creating more things that can break. More people I can disappoint, more ways everything can fall apart." "You're not going to disappoint anyone. And even if things do fall apart someday, which they won't, you'll have proven that something better is possible. That's worth more than you think." Clara didn't answer. She just held Sarah close and let herself believe for a moment that maybe Elias was right. Maybe what they'd built was strong enough to withstand whatever came next. That belief was tested in August when a flash flood tore through the eastern section of the Double G, destroying fences and drowning 11 cattle. It was a devastating loss, made worse by the fact that 2 other cooperative ranches were hit even harder, losing entire herds. The cooperative fund had reserves for exactly this kind of disaster, but watching Clara distribute emergency payments to ranchers who just started to feel secure again felt like failing all over again. "This is what the fund is for," Elias reminded her when she sat at the kitchen table late one night, calculating and recalculating how much they could afford to give without bankrupting the whole system. "I know, but it's not enough. The Johnsons lost everything, their entire herd, half their infrastructure, and their barn. Emergency funds will help them survive, but they won't be able to rebuild to where they were." "Then we help them rebuild. We all do, together," which is exactly what happened. Over the next 3 months, every ranch in the cooperative contributed labor, materials, or additional funds to help the flood-damaged properties recover. It wasn't charity. Everyone understood that supporting each other strengthened the entire network. And when the Johnsons' new barn went up in October, built by hands from a dozen different ranches, Clara stood with Sarah and watched and felt something fierce and proud settle in her chest. This was what they'd built. Not just ranches and profits and breeding programs, but a community that took care of its own. By November, Sarah was walking confidently and starting to form actual words instead of just baby babble. Her favorite word was da, which she used for Elias, the horses, the cattle, and occasionally a particularly interesting rock. "She's brilliant," Elias declared solemnly after Sarah successfully identified a cow as moo. "She's average for her age," Clara said, amused. "Every parent thinks their child is brilliant." "Yes, but ours actually is." Clara laughed and pulled him down for a kiss, Sarah squirming between them and demanding attention. They'd had this conversation 100 times, and she'd never gotten tired of it. This small domestic happiness that they'd fought so hard to build. The first anniversary of buying the Double G came and went without fanfare. They were too busy preparing for winter and managing the cooperative and chasing after an increasingly mobile toddler to celebrate. But one evening in December, Clara found Elias in the study, staring at the map that showed both properties. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "I was thinking about what this place looked like when you first arrived. The house was falling apart, the ranch was barely functional, and I was one bad season away from losing everything." He traced the property lines on the map. "Now we own twice as much land, we've got the most respected breeding program in the territory, and we're teaching other ranchers how to do the same thing. It's like looking at a completely different life." "It is a completely different life. We built it together." "You built most of it." "No," Clara said firmly. "I had the ideas, but you had the foundation. You had this land, this house, the knowledge and the stubbornness to keep fighting when everything looked hopeless. I just helped you see possibilities you couldn't see yourself." Elias reached for her hand. "I love you. I don't say it enough, but I do. Everything good in my life started the day you walked into Hutchins' store with 7 cents and too much pride to beg." Clara felt her throat tighten. "I love you too, and I'm grateful every single day that you saw me as something more than desperate charity case. I saw you as someone worth fighting for. Still do." They sat together in the quiet study, hands intertwined, while Sarah slept upstairs, and the wind howled outside, and the ranch they'd built together settled into winter silence. There would be more challenges ahead. There were always more challenges, but they'd face them the way they'd faced everything else. Together, stubborn and determined, and absolutely refusing to give up. The years that followed proved something Clara had suspected but never quite believed. That survival could eventually transform into something that looked almost like peace. Not perfect peace. The ranch still demanded everything they had, and some years were brutal enough to make them question their choices all over again. There was the grasshopper plague when Sarah was 3 that destroyed half their grazing land. The winter when Sarah was 5 that killed 20 head of cattle and put 2 cooperative ranches on the edge of bankruptcy. The summer Sarah turned 7 when a wildfire swept through the eastern hills, and they spent 3 days fighting to save their property and their neighbors. But through it all, the foundation they'd built held. The cooperative absorbed losses and celebrated wins together. The breeding program continued to produce exceptional stock that commanded premium prices, and the apprenticeship program that Clara had fought so hard to establish graduated its first class of young ranchers who went on to start their own operations or take over family spreads with fresh knowledge and modern techniques. Clara watched those young people succeed and felt something she'd never expected, pride that had nothing to do with her own accomplishments. She'd helped create a system that would outlive her, that would keep helping people long after she was gone. That mattered in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Sarah grew up tough and opinionated, with her mother's sharp mind and her father's stubborn streak. By the time she was 8, she could ride better than most adults, manage the ranch books when Clara needed help, and argue circles around anyone who made the mistake of underestimating her because she was young or female. "She's going to be formidable," Tom observed one afternoon, watching Sarah convince 3 grown men that they'd measured the fence line wrong and needed to redo the entire section. "She already is," Clara said with a mixture of pride and mild concern. "I just hope she uses that stubbornness for something good, instead of driving everyone around her crazy." "Like mother, like daughter," Elias said, grinning when Clara shot him a look. They had 2 more children over the years, a son named James, who arrived when Sarah was 4, and another daughter, Mary, who who came along 3 years after that. The house that had once felt too big for two people became loud and chaotic and full of the kind of life Clara had never imagined having. Some days she was so tired she could barely function, pulled in a dozen directions by children and ranch work and cooperative business, and the constant demands of running an operation that now employed 12 people full-time. There were moments when she looked at the woman she'd become, exhausted, perpetually covered in some combination of dirt and baby spit-up, arguing about cattle breeding practices while simultaneously trying to stop James from eating rocks, and couldn't quite reconcile her with the desperate seamstress who'd once counted pennies for bread. But she also wouldn't trade it. Not the chaos, not the exhaustion, not even the moments of pure frustration when everything felt like too much. Because woven through all of it was love, the kind that grew slowly over years of shared struggle, the kind that showed up in Elias making sure she ate breakfast when she was too busy to remember, in Sarah reading stories to her younger siblings so Clara could finish the accounts, in James bringing her wildflowers he'd picked because Mama looked sad, in Mary falling asleep in her arms after a hard day. That love was the thing Clara had been searching for without knowing it when she'd walked into Hutchins' store with 7 cents. Not romantic love, though she had that too, but the deeper kind, the sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than herself, of mattering to people who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. When Sarah turned 12, she asked Clara a question that stopped her cold. "Why did you marry Papa?" They were working in the garden together, pulling weeds in the late afternoon sun. Clara sat back on her heels and studied her daughter's serious face. "That's a complicated question." "I know, that's why I'm asking." Sarah yanked out a particularly stubborn weed. "Jenny Morrison says you only married Papa because you needed money and he needed a woman to keep house. She says it wasn't real love, just convenience." Clara felt a flash of anger at Jenny Morrison and her mother, who apparently still gossiped about things that were none of their business. But she forced it down and thought about how to answer honestly. "When I married your father, I was desperate. I had nothing, no money, no home, no prospects. I'd lost everything after my own father died, and I was one step away from starving, or worse." Clara pulled another weed, buying time to organize her thoughts. "Your father gave me a job when I needed one. He treated me with respect when most people treated me like a scandal or a charity case. And yes, part of why we got married was practical, legal protection, legitimacy in the eyes of people who cared about such things." So Jenny's right? No. Because what Jenny doesn't understand is that love isn't just one thing. It's not just the feeling you get when you first meet someone, though that can be part of it. Real love, the kind that lasts, is built over time through shared struggles and mutual respect and choosing each other every single day, even when it's hard. Sarah considered this. "So you didn't love Papa when you married him?" "I respected him. I admired his strength and his fairness. I was grateful for his kindness." Clara met her daughter's eyes. "But I fell in love with him slowly, over months and years of working beside him, seeing how he handled crises, watching him try to do the right thing even when it cost him. And he fell in love with me the same way, not because I was perfect or easy, but because we became partners in something bigger than either of us alone." "That doesn't sound very romantic." Clara laughed. "No, I suppose it doesn't, but it's real, and it's lasted, and it's given us this family and this life. That's worth more than a dozen romantic stories about love at first sight." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I told Jenny she didn't know what she was talking about." "Good. Because she doesn't." That conversation stayed with Clara long after Sarah wandered off to help Elias in the barn. She'd spent so many years focused on survival and success that she'd never really stopped to examine what she and Elias had built together. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd imagined as a young girl. There had been no dramatic declarations, no grand gestures, no moment when everything suddenly became perfect. Instead, it had been quieter and deeper and infinitely more complicated. It had been learning to trust someone after losing everything. It had been choosing partnership over independence, even when independence felt safer. It had been fighting for something together and discovering that the fight itself created bonds stronger than any promise. That was the real story, Clara thought. Not the romance, but the partnership. Not the rescue, but the rebuilding. Not the happy ending, but the daily choice to keep building something worth keeping. By the time Sarah was 15, She was running significant portions of the ranch operation herself. She had her mother's head for business and her father's instinct for cattle, and she'd absorbed everything the cooperative network had to teach about modern ranching practices. Several neighboring ranchers had already approached Elias about arranging matches between Sarah and their sons, which made Sarah laugh and Clara deeply uncomfortable. "She's too young to think about marriage," Clara said firmly when Elias mentioned the latest proposal, this one from the Harrison family, whose son Robert was apparently a fine young man with good prospects. "She's 15, you were married by 18. And I was desperate and had no other options. Sarah has options. She has education and opportunity and a future that doesn't depend on marrying well." Clara set down the letter from the Harrisons. "I won't push her into anything before she's ready. I'm not suggesting we push her. I'm just saying we should be prepared for her to start thinking about these things herself." Elias watched Sarah through the window, where she was showing James how to properly inspect cattle hooves. "She's going to make her own choices regardless of what we want." "I know. That's what terrifies me." Sarah did make her own choices, starting with announcing at 16 that she had no intention of marrying anyone until she'd run a ranch successfully on her own. She wanted to prove she could do it without a husband's name or a father's legacy, and no amount of practical argument from Clara or Elias could change her mind. "She's exactly like you," Elias said to Clara, after another dinner conversation where Sarah had calmly demolished every reason they'd offered for why marriage and partnership might be beneficial. "I was never that stubborn." Elias just looked at her. "Fine. I was exactly that stubborn, but I had good reasons. So does she. She wants to prove herself the same way you did." Elias pulled Clara close. "We raised her to be independent and confident and capable. We can't be surprised when she actually is those things." He was right, of course. Sarah was everything they'd hoped she'd be: strong, smart, determined, and absolutely unwilling to let anyone else define her worth. If that meant she postponed marriage and struck out on her own, then Clara would support her even while worrying constantly about everything that could go wrong. The years continued their relentless march. James grew into a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved the cattle but had no interest in the business side of ranching. Mary turned out to be the peacemaker of the family, the one who could talk Sarah out of her most reckless plans and convince James to actually voice his opinions instead of just going along with whatever anyone else wanted. Clara watched her children grow and felt time moving in a way she'd never noticed before. Suddenly, Sarah was 18 and announcing she was going to run one of the cooperative ranches as their new manager. James was 14 and spending every spare moment with the apprentices, learning advanced breeding techniques. Mary was 11 and already showing signs of her mother's organizational genius, keeping track of family schedules and cooperative meetings with meticulous detail. "When did they stop being babies?" Clara asked Elias one night after a particularly chaotic family dinner where Sarah and James had argued about breeding philosophy, while Mary had calmly mediated and assigned them both research tasks to prove their points. "About 10 years ago, I think. We just didn't notice because we were too busy trying to keep everything from falling apart." Elias pulled her against his side. "They're good kids, Clara. Better than we had any right to expect. They're incredible and terrifying. Sarah's going to give me gray hair with her risk-taking. James is going to internalize every problem until he breaks. And Mary's going to try to fix everyone around her instead of taking care of herself." "So they're like us." Clara laughed despite herself. "Yes. Exactly like us. We're doomed." But they weren't doomed. The children thrived in their different ways, each of them taking pieces of what Clara and Elias had built and making them their own. Sarah's ranch became one of the most profitable in the cooperative within 3 years, her innovative approaches attracting attention from across the territory. James developed a breeding line that produced cattle specifically adapted to harsh winter conditions. And Mary, at just 15, created a record-keeping system for the cooperative that was so efficient it was adopted by ranches throughout the region. Claire was 50 years old when she realized something that should have been obvious much earlier. She'd succeeded far beyond anything she'd imagined that day in Hutchins' store. She wasn't just surviving. She'd built an empire. Not the kind made of wealth or power, but the kind made of relationships and knowledge and systems that helped people succeed. The cooperative now included 43 ranches. The apprenticeship program had graduated over 100 young ranchers. The Blackstone Ridge breeding standards were recognized across multiple territories as the benchmark for quality stock. And at the center of it all was the partnership she'd built with Elias, flawed and human and absolutely real. That realization hit her one morning when she was sitting on the porch watching the sunrise over the valley. Elias found her there, coffee in hand, and settled beside her with the easy comfort of 30 years together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked.
Everything? Nothing. Clara took the coffee he offered. "Do you remember what you said to me the day I showed up here asking for work?" "I said a lot of things, most of them probably stupid. You said you'd pay me fair wages and wouldn't ask questions about my past or make assumptions about my future." Clara smiled at the memory. "That was the first time anyone had treated me like I was worth more than my worst circumstances. You were always worth more. I just saw it before you did."
"No, I saw it. I just didn't believe anyone else would." Clara turned to look at him. "You gave me more than a job that day, Elias. You gave me the space to rebuild myself into someone I could be proud of." Elias set down his coffee and took her hand. "You did the rebuilding. I just got out of your way and tried not to mess it up too badly. We rebuilt together. That's the point." Clara squeezed his hand. "I spent so long thinking that needing someone was weakness, that asking for help was admitting defeat. But what we've built here, the ranch, the cooperative, the family, none of it would exist if we hadn't been willing to need each other." "Are you getting philosophical on me in our old age? I'm 50, not ancient. And yes, I'm getting philosophical because I'm trying to figure out what we tell our grandchildren when they ask why their family's story matters." Elias raised an eyebrow. "We don't have grandchildren yet. We will. Sarah's going to get married eventually, no matter how much she insists she's married to her ranch. James already has 2 girls interested in him that I know of, and Mary's going to break hearts right and left when she's older." Clara smiled. "And when those grandchildren arrive, they're going to want to know where they came from and what it all means. So what are you going to tell them?"
Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the sun climb higher over the valley that had been hostile territory when she'd first arrived, and now felt like home in every sense that mattered. "I'm going to tell them that their grandmother was 1 penny short of bread when their grandfather first saw her, that she was so desperate she was willing to do anything except beg, that she thought survival was the best she could hope for, and partnership was a luxury she couldn't afford. And then what? And then I'm going to tell them that their grandfather saw past the desperation to the person underneath, that he gave her work instead of charity, respect instead of pity, and space to become who she was meant to be." Claire's voice softened. "I'm going to tell them that together we took nothing and built it into something that mattered. Not because we were special or lucky or destined for greatness, but because we were stubborn and we refused to give up on each other even when it would have been easier to quit." Elias pulled her close. "That's a good story. It's a true story. That's what makes it good." Clara leaned into him. "I want them to know that hard times don't define you. How you respond to them does. I want them to know that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And I want them to know that the best things in life are built slowly, over years of choosing to show up even when it's hard." "You're going to make me cry if you keep this up." Clara laughed. "We've cried over worse things. Might as well cry over something good for once." They sat together on the porch they'd rebuilt 3 times over the years, watching the valley wake up beneath them. The cattle were already moving toward the creek. In the distance, ranch hands were beginning their daily work. Somewhere inside the house, Mary was probably already organizing everyone's schedules for the day. It was ordinary and beautiful, and everything Clara had fought so hard to build. 3 years later, Sarah married a rancher she'd met through the cooperative, a quiet man named Daniel who matched her stubbornness with patient determination and her ambition with steady support. They had a daughter within the year, and when Clara held her first grandchild, she understood for the first time what legacy actually meant. It wasn't the ranch or the cooperative or even the breeding programs that would outlive them. It was this. The continuation of love and stubborn hope passed from one generation to the next, each one building on what came before and making it their own. More grandchildren followed. James married an apprentice-turned-rancher named Elizabeth and gave them twin boys who were holy terrors from birth. Mary surprised everyone by falling in love with a banker from Silver Creek and moving to town,
though she stayed deeply involved in cooperative management and visited the ranch every month. Clara and Elias became the elder statesmen of the ranching community, the ones younger people came to for advice and perspective. They'd lived through enough disasters to know that most crises felt worse than they actually were, and they'd built enough success to understand that luck was mostly just preparation meeting opportunity. On Clara's 60th birthday, the cooperative threw a celebration that filled the barn and spilled out into the yard. 43 ranching families came to honor the woman who'd transformed the region from a collection of struggling operations into a network of mutual support and shared prosperity. The speeches were long and occasionally embarrassing, full of gratitude and praise that made Clara uncomfortable. She'd never done any of it for recognition. She'd done it to survive, and then to help others survive, and somewhere along the way it had become bigger than she'd imagined. When it was finally her turn to speak, Clara stood at the front of the barn with Elias beside her and looked out at the crowd of people whose lives had intersected with hers over the past 3 decades. "I'm not good at speeches," she began, "so I'll keep this short. 32 years ago, I walked into Hutchins' store with 7 cents in my hand and no idea where my next meal was coming from. I was 1 penny short of bread and too proud to beg for it." She paused, letting the familiar story settle over the crowd. "What happened next changed my life. A man I'd never met paid for that bread without humiliating me. He gave me work when I needed it. He treated me like a partner instead of a burden. And together, we built something I never could have built alone." Clara looked at Elias, who was watching her with the same steady attention he'd shown for 30 years. "I learned something important from that experience. I learned that the way we treat people when they're desperate says everything about who we are. I learned that strength isn't refusing help. It's knowing when to ask for it and how to offer it without crushing someone's dignity. And I learned that the best things we build in this life are built with other people, not in spite of them." She turned back to the crowd. "That's what this cooperative represents. It's not my achievement, or Elias's achievement, or any one person's achievement. It's what we accomplished together by refusing to let hard times turn us cruel or suspicious, by choosing to help each other instead of competing ourselves into the ground, by believing that making our neighbors stronger makes us stronger too." Clara's voice grew firmer. "The world is going to tell you that success means getting ahead of everyone else, that asking for help makes you weak, that independence is everything and partnership is a compromise. Don't believe it. The strongest thing you can do is build something bigger than yourself. The smartest thing you can do is surround yourself with people who'll help you through hard times and celebrate with you through good ones. And the most important thing you can do is pass on what you've learned to people who come after you." She smiled at the crowd, at the faces young and old, at the next generation who would take what they'd built and make it their own. "I started with 7 cents and no prospects. I'm ending with a family, a community, and the knowledge that what we've built will outlive us. That's not magic. That's just what happens when you refuse to give up and refuse to face the hard times alone." The applause that followed was loud and long, but Clara barely heard it. She was looking at Sarah holding her daughter, at James standing with his sons, at Mary across the room with her husband. She was looking at Elias beside her, his hand finding hers like it had 1,000 times before. This was the real victory. Not the success or the reputation or the empire they'd built, but the love that had grown from one impulsive act of kindness in a dusty store, expanding outward in ripples that would continue long after she and Elias were gone. That was legacy. That was what mattered. Clara and Elias lived another 15 years after that celebration, years that were gentler than the ones that came before. They handed over daily ranch operations to Sarah and James while staying involved in cooperative leadership. They watched their grandchildren grow into capable, confident young people who took the lessons their grandparents had learned through hard experience and applied them to challenges Clara couldn't have imagined. When Elias died at 78, peacefully, in his sleep, after a long day working cattle with James, Clara grieved with the deep, abiding sorrow of someone who'd lost their truest partner. But she didn't break. She'd learned too much about survival to break now. She lived 3 more years after Elias passed. Years she spent documenting the cooperative's history and ensuring that the systems they'd built would continue without her. She wrote letters to each grandchild, telling them stories about who their grandparents had been and what they'd believed and why it all mattered. And on a warm afternoon in early summer, Clara sat on the porch of the ranch that had been her salvation and watched the valley spread out below her one last time. Sarah was inside with the great-grandchildren, their laughter drifting through the open windows. The cattle were healthy, and the land was green, and the cooperative was thriving. Clara closed her eyes and let herself remember that day in Hutchins' store, standing there with 7 cents, 1 penny short, fighting to keep her dignity intact while hunger gnawed at her stomach. She thought that moment was the lowest point of her life, but it had actually been the beginning of everything good that came after. One act of kindness from a stranger who saw past her desperation. One choice to accept help without shame. One decision to partner with someone instead of fighting alone. That's what she wanted people to remember when they told her story. Not that she'd been rescued or saved, but that she'd been given space to rebuild herself into someone who could help others do the same. Not that she'd built an empire, but that she'd created a community. Not that she'd overcome poverty, but that she'd transformed it into compassion that reached beyond her own survival. The penny she'd been short that day had cost her nothing in the end. But the dignity Elias had preserved, the partnership they'd built, the community they'd created, those things had been worth more than she could measure. Clara Boone died peacefully that evening, surrounded by family, having lived exactly the kind of life she'd fought for. One built on stubborn hope, mutual respect, and the radical belief that helping others succeed was the best path to her own success. And in Blackstone Ridge and throughout the territory, the cooperative she'd helped create continued to thrive, carrying forward the lessons she'd learned in a dusty store when she was 1 penny short and refusing to beg. Her great-grandchildren would grow up hearing the story of their great-grandmother who transformed desperation into determination, who turned one act of kindness into a legacy that would outlive them all. Because in the end, that was the real story. Not rags to riches, not rescue, not even love conquering all, but something quieter and truer and infinitely more powerful. The simple revolutionary idea that we don't have to face the hard times alone, and that the things we build together are always stronger than what we build apart. That was Clara Whitmore Boone's legacy. And it was enough.